500 times thanks. Strange, I actually managed to reach 500 subs with debatable videos. And in order to pay your support back, today we're doing a special animation breakdown. Why special? Because we're not dealing with just one episode. I'm DB Animators and this is a new random animation breakdown. Some time ago I posted a poll on Twitter in which I asked you which saga you wanted me to analyze, and most of you chose Boo Saga, so Boo Saga B. Now, since this is our 500 sub special, I'm not going to analyze one episode. It would be far too simple. Instead, we're going to take 7 episodes from a precise moment of Boo Saga, that is the fight against Super Boo. Why 7 episodes? Because 7 is better than 1. So sit back and enjoy this brand new animation breakdown. Let's start with episode 262, supervised by Yukio Ibizawa. He doesn't need to be introduced. I'm sure you're already aware of his triangular shapes. Speaking of this episode, it's the first one not to feature Toshiyuki Kanno on the animation department, who was the savior of Studio Live episodes. I mean, art-wise at least. His contribution raised Ibizawa's episode quality. Also due to his absence, this episode feels mediocre. The art is not that great, and the animation is kinda forgettable. This portion of the fight between Gotenks and Boo looks bland and boring. I never tend to talk about Ibizawa's animation method, since he managed to provide some decent cuts in the past. But here, his animation is so boring that we might even predict his character's future movements. Believe, I don't want to be biased against Ibizawa, but this fight is just nothing special. No trace of good cuts or even good artwork. The second half shows some passable drawings, maybe thanks to the other 2 key animators, but it's not a good episode by no means. Whilst not being Ibizawa's worst ever, I don't like it that much. Moving forward to Ep 263, with Shingo Ishikawa as both animation supervisor and key animator. The art is obviously much better looking than the previous episode. Ishikawa's style is fairly on model but somehow looks different from Yamamuro. The first half focuses more on dialogue while the last one shows the beginning of the fight between Ultimate Gohan and Boo. If we read the animation credits, we can spot 4 key animators who are not part of Ishikawa's team. Noriko Shibata from Yamamoto's team, veteran Tomikichi Takeuchi, Yoko Izuka and Megumi Yamashita from Seigasha. My guess is that we can find their contribution especially on dialogue scenes from the first half. Here Goten's eyes look way too different from how Ishikawa usually draws them, so it's most likely that either Izuka or Yamashita animated this bit, or this one in which his eyes resemble Goku's in Ep 268, which we're going to analyze later on. Regardless, Takeuchi is pretty easy to spot on both halves. During dialogue scenes, he gets noticed for his outline shading, rounder pupils and trembling movements. We can even find some rough Takeuchi shots here and there, since he also worked on episode 258 and due to Shimanuki, Izada and Tate's absence for movie issues, Takeuchi stepped up and acted as a huge professional once again. He animates Gohan's arrival as well, and as always, his movements are rudimentary and basic. After that, I presume the following scene is made by Shibata because their eyes resemble Yamamoto's style more than Ishikawa's. You can see how his eyebrows are much less angular than before, perhaps thanks to Yamamoto's influence or because it was recorrected. But still, the main focus of this episode is on the second half, in which the fight begins. It looks decent overall. However, the impact is really powerful. You can actually feel the intensity of punches and kicks. Takeuchi animated this bit with Gohan thrashing Buu, and again, all of his before mentioned traits can be easily traced, such as shading and tremble. Overall, it's a good episode. The fight scenes are decent and Ishikawa's art appears quite consistent despite not being that polished. Moving on, Ep 264. It's supervised by Yuji Akamada and Studio Carpenter. There is almost nothing to say. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Akamada. Despite being quite on model, I consider his artwork uninteresting and a bit bland. Characters look stiff and also kinda unexpressive. As for the episode, it's meh. Not good, not bad, just meh. Animation wise, nothing important happens, apart from Gohan and Buu fight at the beginning of the first half. It lasted only a few minutes and due to this I cannot evaluate it well. About the animators themselves, there's almost no information, since Akamada's supervision is quite strong. So, that's all. Now, let's start with Ep 265. Same as Ebisawa, Masayuki Uchiyama needs no introduction. I guess at this point you know about his issues with time and staff. In fact, the animation credits look really poor as usual, only 2 key animators. Art-wise, this episode is basically just like any single post-Android Saga episode. Characters look way too pale and cartoonish, proportions and shading are so overrated. Last House had at least 6 weeks provided, which is considerably more time than they used to receive, but it wasn't enough to save Uchiyama's cartoony art. On the other hand, it came in handy for the highlight of this episode, the fight between Ultimate Gohan and Gotenks Buu. This 2-minute long sequence is animated by the man who tried to put Last House back together. Of course, I'm referring to Taichiro Ohara. It's not that great, but you cannot deny how much effort he did put on this. This sequence is quite fast-paced and shows some background animation, which is a trademark trait from Ohara. Yeah, despite characters not looking that appealing, their movements are not that bad. Maybe slow-mo is way too overused, but that doesn't change my opinion. It's a decent scene. And of course, their fighting stances represent a reference to Goku and Vegeta's first fight. This reference would be used by Toyotaro in his manga adaptation of Super. Anyway, this is a mediocre episode. The animation doesn't bother me, but the art style is so inaccurate. Next up is Ep 266, with Masunaga and Studio Cockpit. And it's a great episode with some really interesting visuals. For instance, the art is simply stunning. It has a lot of details and even enjoys the use of a great expressivity. Their so-called off-model looks so much better than some on-model artwork. In this episode, Toshiyuki Kanno has been involved as well and appears on the second half. Even if recorrected, Buu's expression is really intense and his trembling movements can be spotted quite easily. Kanno also worked on the ending sequence with Kaioshin giving Goku his Potara. Even though his bulbous nose has been recorrected, his style is still recognizable through Kaioshin's eyes. Now, on to the animation. Hard to admit, but while being great, the overall animation is not at the same level of Goku vs Cell or Goku vs Kid Buu fights. I mean, we got a nice fight scene animated by Masaki Iwane at the beginning, but it's not among his best work in Dragon Ball Z. I'm not saying it's bad, on the contrary, this episode displays some really neat aerial movements and some cool looking effects. It's not Studio Cockpit's best episode, but it looks incredibly solid. Ep 267 is the 3rd episode to be supervised by Naoaki Oju, and the overall 4th of Kino Production. And it's another good episode, which has almost been recorrected by the uncredited chief animation supervisor Naoki Miyahara. I believe he is better than Yamamuro and Nakatsuru as a supervisor, because he is far more consistent and his art style is not as stressed. Here his contribution basically stole the scene to the other key animators. He's that good. As for the animation, on the first half there's barely no choreographies, since characters make more use of energy blasts. However, after 6 long months, the second half marks the return of our man, our Majesty Naoto Shishida.
Yes, 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 yes!
Who animated the fight scene between Super Saiyan 3 Goku and Gotenks Buu. Personally, I don't think it's one of his best sequences, but it still looks neat. While I consider the use of Zanzo Ken kinda repetitive, I really love his classic impact and smoke effects, not to mention his fast-paced energy waves. Shida's artwork is recorrected by Miyahara, but we can easily trace him through his swift close-ups and keyframes. It's not a brilliant sequence, but shares some distinctive elements which makes it stand out enough. Overall, this episode is not as good as the previous one, but it does appear quite solid. And last but not least, Ep 268 by Kazuya Izada and Segasha. This episode marks the return of Segasha after a long hiatus, since their last work was in Ep 231. This long pause has most likely been caused by the main animators being busy working for movie 12, which looked so outstanding thanks to time and actual talent. As for this episode, the first half looks a bit rushed, since Takeuchi Iizuka and Yamashita had already taken part of Ep 263. Izada's supervision came quite in handy, even though he couldn't save some unnatural and choppy movements. Besides, we can find some rough shots in this half, as if they were drawn only using the pencil. The same thing happens at the beginning of the second half too, until Kazuya Izada steps in. The difference is almost abyssal. I love how his art style looks so peculiar without imitating Yamamura or Shimanuki. Of course, he animates the opening of the fight between Super Saiyan 2 Vegeta and Buu. This scene shares some familiar traits, such as blurred lines, elongated and exaggerated movements, and focus on every keyframe. Yep, the same elements currently used by Naoki Tate. Speaking of Tate, he animates the following scenes, which again show how much he's growing as a professional. I believe at this point he's becoming slightly more independent. His animation still follows Shimanuki and Izada, but at the same time Tate is adding some new features to make his work stand out. So, in addition to shaking impact and exaggerated motions, we can find his signature smears, which are overused by Tate nowadays. Art-wise, his characters are not rubbery as his current style, thus you should not expect them to have a big expressivity. Regardless, his facial proportions kinda resemble his own nowadays. For example, this shot of Goku looks identical to one of his corrections in episode 5 of Super. Sometimes I also feel his current drawings are still inspired by Shimanuki. And speaking of Shima, he handles the remaining scenes of the episode. We get some pretty nice aerial choreographies and also some really compelling effects. It's a pity he no longer animates this well, but at least he still knows how to draw accurately. His artwork is one of the best from Dragon Ball. It displays some terrific details and proportions are basically perfect. Needless to say, Vegito's first appearance is animated by Shimanuki, as we can deduce from his shaking limbs as well. I guess this episode might be compared with episode 98 of Super. Both of them have a fantastic scene towards the end, and both with Shimanuki's contribution. Overall, this final episode has a weak first half and a more substantial second half. So that was my 500 sub special. Sorry if it took me a lot to prepare this video. I know it's not an original idea, but I hope you enjoyed this journey. Again, thanks for your support, for your comments on both YouTube and Twitter, and see ya on the next video.